You're listening to Outcome by Design with Paul Weinstein, a series about the untold stories of the tech world. Let's get into today's episode.
All right. My guest today is rock god guitarist and VP of Corporate Development at LinkedIn, Ben Orthlieb.
I'm aspiring to both of those things, actually. Thank you.
I think it's pretty clear what your priorities are just by what's in your background here.
You get the guitar side, like this is the work side. That's what I actually look at.
Yeah. You got the surfboard. You got the, is that a kiteboard or a surfboard?
I opened up the season yesterday.
Even better.
Actually,
even better. Good for you. You're right in the right place. So, as you know, kind of what we talked about, what we do here at Outcome by Design is try to get a better understanding of why things happened, and then hopefully extract some of that wisdom to share with our listeners here. So it's the idea is not the Instagram version, but kind of the behind the scenes, roadies only see it version. That's the interesting part for me, and I think it's going to be the interesting part for the listeners here as well. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask you this question. So you get to pick one of the following to have a private dinner with. Who do you choose and why? And this is tailored to you. So, okay, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, or Bob Marley? Why? If you're going to pick why amongst those three.
Well, the other two are fairly written about, so maybe more is known. And then Bob Marley is my sort of, since I'm like 12, number one singer, songwriter, everything. And did not overlap in history very much with him. So I'd like to figure out, I've seen pretty much everything about the impact, but I'd love to get a little bit more in the sort of what he was thinking about it or how he was thinking through it, which again, like Buffett and Elon Musk, sure would be super interesting, but there's so much that's written about how they're thinking about things. I have no idea what Bob Marley was thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, I would pick Bob Marley too, but just out of curiosity, if you had one question, what would you ask him?
Did he have the impact he thought he was going, or he was setting out to have?
Well, you wouldn't know. He wouldn't know the answer to that.
Oh,
I mean, I guess if he was
alive,
still alive, you could ask him
that. He had impact, but I don't know if that was way more than he imagined, or if he was just actually still on the map or still on the journey.
Yeah, my guess is 100 years from now, people will talk more about Bob Marley than Warren Buffett. Although who knows? So we'll see.
Musk, if you put people on Mars, I think people will still talk about him.
He gets that. If he gets there, he gets the credit. Sure. Okay. Anyway, now that we have that out of the way, here's what I think would be helpful. There's a ton of misinformation about how companies actually get acquired by major players like LinkedIn or your parent company, Microsoft. It's almost as if it's portrayed that it's some sort of kind of mystical thing. Founders are going out the business, 110% focused on their customers and products. And then, one day Google or Salesforce or LinkedIn comes knocking on the door with a giant check and says, hey, you guys interested? So what I'd like, if you can, is help me set the record straight with some sort of honest information. You're an expert. You do this day in and day out. So, walk me through the typical stages of an acquisition. How does it start? Does it start with you? Does it start with someone in the product group? Does the CEO come to you and say, what? Just give me your initial kind of perspective. What do you tell, founders?
Maybe the first thing is the point where you said, Google shows up with the check ready to buy you over the weekend. I've never seen it. I'm sure it does happen. Like Instagram is an example of that, I think, but it is very, very, very rare and very unlikely, which is interesting because I think you've said that. I had seen 97% and you said 98% of companies, startups end up being acquired. And so that's the image that somebody shows up over the weekend is definitely not the mainstream of what's going to happen. Maybe I'll start a little bit differently, which is I'll tell you what my team actually does at Corp Dev, because it reflects that flow of how we think about it. And then I'll translate that for founders. But a lot of the job we do, which is less traditional, but it is actually knowing what's going on in the landscape. So whether it's tracking a lot of public companies, also tracking all sorts of news from fundraisers, M&A, sometimes product announcement. But we track companies, or we try to know about companies pretty much like from sometimes seed or Series A that would be in the spaces that are broadly relevant to us and to our product groups. And that's where I think it all starts, which is my team and I then start working with our product folks and help define the strategy, help inform the strategy. And that's where we start conversations with companies. And I don't necessarily reach out at that point with hey, do you want to sell your company? It's much more, hey, you're working in a space that's interesting to LinkedIn. Would you be interested in having discussions and comparing notes with the product folks or the engineering folks, or product and engineering, I guess. But those conversations are in many ways like very top funnel, and they're not meant to mean an M&A. They're just meant, frankly, an opportunity for both sides to learn a little bit more about each other. And my metric for success here is we had an interesting meeting, not, oh, I did an acquisition out of that. Sometimes those conversations are, hey, let's keep a channel going, and product to product folks get to know each other and have a chat every quarter, every 6 months. Sometimes some of that ends up being partnership, and sometimes, usually way later, there might be an M&A point. But I think all this to say, this is usually a relationship path that then gets you to potentially exploring an M&A. And if I flip it the other way around, is if you're a founder, who are the 3 most likely acquirers for you? And do you have a relationship with product and R&D, which Corp Dev is there to facilitate and help. But in many ways, those are the conversations that lead to, in my opinion, the successful acquisition, because then both sides go eyes wide open. And those are also the relationship that you can activate when somebody is approaching you with M&A, and you can turn around because now you have 3 or 4 warm discussions going on with folks and saying, hey, I'm getting an interested party, but I'd be much rather excited about working with LinkedIn or working with X in the future, given the alignment that we've sort of seen play out over the last few years or few months.
So, but you've got a product group that is in charge of some specific product line at LinkedIn or at anywhere for that matter. And how far in advance are they giving you, or are you working together with them on coming up with categories of things that are going to be interesting within the next year or 18 months?
We generally align with all of them on sort of quarterly exploration priorities, which means what are those things that they're looking at mid to long term that we should start spending time now. And so a lot of those topics sort of, end up being greenfield for a period of time. But that's oftentimes how we start, by saying, okay, great, we're going to use some of the Corp Dev resources to better understand the landscape, to start reaching out and having conversation with a few of the companies that we think are interesting for what our roadmap looks like. And that's when we then create those relationships with product and R&D.
So there's a product roadmap. They're saying, I want these 5 features or this access to this particular market share. And then do you go about working with them on thinking, okay, well, which ones are we going to build versus which ones we're going to buy? Or is it more open-ended than that?
It's usually both. They're looking at what does the build path looks like. And we're saying, here are people in the landscape that can be interesting for us to, again, like potentially partner with. And there's a BD team. And so we work closely with them on that. And we exchange notes on priorities. But oftentimes it's not even that sort of crisp yet. It's like, hey, the next thing that we need to think about to come up with a strategy is going to be X, this particular space. And then from there, you say, okay, cool. What you work both in terms of what do we want to build internally, potentially, or what do we want this to be for our customers or members, and exchange notes with companies. From there, you know that, hey, maybe there's not really a fit with what we're looking for, or hey, there are companies that are in similar sort of areas. At that point, we may decide that we don't want to build, but maybe we want to partner. And so that's how it happens. So it's usually, the ideal is when we engage 2 to 3 years before something is really a hot priority, because then it's kind of too late, so that we have time to think and get to know each other on both sides.
And so who's the key person on the product or the engineering side? Is it a senior level person there? Is it someone in the middle? Who is the one that is kind of driving the discussions? Not necessarily makes the decisions, but
It's a little bit of both. Generally, it will be the product manager and his or her sort of engineering counterpart for that particular product, which may already be fairly high level depending on the sort of product area. And then more specific to us, we tend to have um, people in engineering and product a little bit more with a little bit more cycles dedicated to engage, sometimes to do the first calls actually, and then sort of keep a broader view across the portfolio of our business line. So if we wanted to have a discussion for our talent side, there's a couple of people maybe in a specific product area, but we also have a couple of people that we usually work with across the portfolio of M&A conversations who are more used to what the process is like, what are sort of usually the hurdles that we need to think about from, say, an engineering standpoint.
are those people on the product side or the business development people, or who is that?
Product and engineering.
Yeah. Okay. And so, how much access do you have to these people's time? I imagine they're busy. They've got their own product roadmaps and, they're working on stuff. How much of their time is dedicated to meeting with external companies and thinking about things like, what might be a good buy versus build path?
Yeah. Well, that's why we align on priorities on an ongoing basis, so we can be clear on that and having some cycles. So there's these sort of dedicated people that have a little bit of time. Usually they're available. And then the specific product folks tend to be motivated because if it is informing their strategy or potentially helping their roadmaps. So that's one of the learning is if you have people that are just too generic, they don't have an incentive. You need people who have sort of an M&A angle or dedicated part of their job to spend time, and then you basically align the incentives by meeting the person that a conversation is helping.
Is there some sort of set out framework about how you think about acquisitions though? Like, is this something we want to buy or something we want to build? I mean, how do you go through that process internally?
Yeah, we've spent quite a bit of time developing what we call our M&A playbooks. So the process is being sort of explained, and there are specific gates. Of course, there's going to be variation in flavors depending on the type of acquisitions, etc., and specific to the particular company we're talking to. But because we have 4 or 5 lines of business, we wanted to make sure we're generally doing M&A the same way or engaging even at the top the same way. And so we have defined gates as to when we start sort of signaling that we're engaging with a company, various levels of approvals, etc.
But how do you decide? I mean, is there some corporate decision matrix? One of your product managers has feature X they want to offer. He's thinking, I just don't have enough manpower to get this done. Or, maybe there's another company that's doing really well and it would accelerate my development to get that. How do you help them, or do they help you think through the process of, well, we should go out and buy somebody versus, forget that?
It's not really, we don't start with buy, actually. We start with exploring. And so it goes back to, so there's kind of two patterns. One is we agree that area X is important for us to learn more about. And so the typical thing that a corp dev team would do is a landscape, trying to understand the various types of players, what are they doing in the value chain? And then from there, have a conversation with that product manager and the sort of lead engineer from that area and have a discussion about which areas, sub areas actually really matter. And from there, propose reaching out to a few companies in that space. That's one motion. And the second motion is we already are aware of a space or of a priority, and we see something either interesting in the news or in the data we track around companies, and ping the right product or engineering folks to say, hey, we think, Paul.co is very interesting and they seem to be having more traction than the last time we talked to them. Would it be worth revisiting? Or Paul.co just appeared on our radar. Here's what they do. Probably worth a first discussion to figure out what's going on.
I get that part of it. But the part I don't get here's an example. So, I've done a whole lot of these things and different companies look at it differently. So if you go to Oracle, you'll have a product manager or somebody in the product side of things or engineering side sometimes who'll say, we got to acquire this company. They're doing really cool stuff or whatever it happens to be. And so there's a framework around that guy that if he wants to do that deal, he's got to justify it. And like they ask typical questions like what 5 or 10 deals in your group would you have won versus lost for your competition in order to get that done? Or, how much would it cost you to build this? And what's the time trade-off between, building and buying in quality and all that sort of stuff? So my question from you, Google, on the other hand, Google's on the other way around. The product manager can kind of just do whatever they want. They have a budget and they do things opportunistically. But from your perspective, again, how do you help your business level, product level team think about that?
So if they're interested in going for an acquisition, then we effectively have a couple of main ways of thinking about it. One is what we call a strategy discussion with its specific approvals, which is why is this a priority that it'd be worth spending M&A dollars into, to your point, what's justifying the acquisition? For us, it's less about, or I haven't seen a case about, oh, we've lost these deals or anything like that, but it's much more accelerating our roadmap is usually the center of what we focus on. So again, it's more sort of 3 to 5 years out sort of thinking than just purely, oh, this is what is happening right now. It tends to be too late if that's the case for us. But you have a strategy conversation, which is, well, as part of this line of business, why is this a priority? Why is this company the right company to go after versus potentially alternatives? What would it take for us to buy? Can we start to build? Can we build it? All sort of these natural questions that you have to think through to get conviction. And then there's a very sort of clear financial framework also for how we value an acquisition then going into it.
Well, we'll get into that little point in a second, but just again, back on the earlier point, is the person who owns the acquisition, whether it's a manager or a VP or what have you over there, are they signing? So let's say you're going to buy a company for $100 million. Are they signing up for something in particular? Meaning like, okay, you're spending $100 million of company money here. Here's what I want back in return. Or is it just every case is different and, it just depends on how good a case anybody makes.
What I want back in return is here's what it's going to create.
So there's no kind of specificity, on, okay, I want this thing to, increase market share 5%, or, I'm going to have to win these extra deals.
Every deal is different from that standpoint. We basically have we have a tracker with metrics for success acquisition. Like, are we, so that we know we're being successful. And there's a bunch of metrics that are business drivers. And usually we have what we call a sort of a North Star, which is everything else is red, but this one is green. The deal would still be considered a success. But those metrics will vary, and they will vary by sort of product areas. And they don't have to be like dollars or market share. They can be create X% lift in engagement, because we're an engagement company as well.
Sure. Okay. So let's look at it from the perspective of a founder. Let's just say let's take LinkedIn Learning for no particular reason. You've got a new AI tool that will allow anyone to be able to go through the LinkedIn catalog and get something that's really specific in terms of what they would like. So you'll help them you'll help them kind of hone in on something so that the, engagement level in your classes goes up. So it's not something that particularly corporate dev has identified as a category or the product manager has really thought about much because it's all brand new. What are that founder's steps for figuring out, how to work with LinkedIn and maybe queuing itself up for something in the future?
Yeah, the best two paths is ultimately they want to have a conversation and an ongoing relationship with the right product/eng person. The easiest path is frankly to reach out to me or my team, because then we can navigate the org for them. And if there's interest then for engaging on the product side, then we sort of broker those meetings and make sure they happen and sort of run the process from there. Or you already know one of the PMs that's the right person at LinkedIn, and you ping them and they will let us know that they're having a conversation.
Let's say it was going to go through you. So first they would have to convince you that it was something interesting, because otherwise you're not going to waste your product manager's time, right?
So you'd ping me and you describe your company. I can already tell you if it's 100% not interesting. If I don't know, or if I know it's interesting, then we have a quick exchange, which is much easier with the right folks. We sometimes put in a recommendation, or sometimes we don't, in terms of we think it's interesting meeting or not. Which when we would recommend is we think it's interesting. Otherwise, we'd be neutral. But maybe sometimes we miss stuff, and so the product folks then let us know, and then we take it from there. But it's in conjunction with them.
Sure. So, but you're determining whether something is interesting based on kind of what their product roadmap is, or your just general feeling of the space, or
no. It's like I would know something is definitely not interesting, or something is very interesting based on the work we're doing on an ongoing basis with our product managers. I mean, in many ways, a part of my team is input into strategy and actually being very close to the PM and engineering teams, so that they actually have a very good feel for this. And again, if we don't know, we don't know, and we it's easy to ask. Maybe to clarify this a little bit, depending on company, this may not be corp dev's job. Oftentimes, there are sort of product strategy teams, or more broadly strategy teams, that actually take care more of what I call this sort of strategy approval or strategy discussion that leads to a strategy approval piece. At LinkedIn, it happens to be corp dev for good reasons. And so that's the role that my team plays then, in terms of, like, in many ways, they're as much internal relationship managers with product management and engineering, and needing to be aware of strategy so we can help the org then navigate engagement with the external landscape of founders.
Right. I mean, I think there's a sentiment out there, and it changes by person and obviously by company, but that, so corp dev is kind of one other step in between you, the founder, and, getting to the product person that they really want to, talk to.
That's what we're here to facilitate.
Yeah. And I think some people think that as a pro because you can help, and some people think of it as a con because you're like, it's one other filter that they have to pass through in order to get to the person that, who would understand them, in quotes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I understand some of the details of technology, but we know, or we can know very quickly, which is what happens, what places are of interest. And we share when we can sometimes say, hey, here's something in this space. We've looked at it 25 times and we don't think it's interesting, but tell us if you want something different. Like, I'm not a real filter in that sense, that I'm another hurdle. My job is to facilitate the right conversations.
Got it. Okay. All right. Now let me switch gears a second and ask you the second thing that people always want to know. And again, it's super opaque, is, let's just say you want to buy a company. There's good alignment. The teams look like they'd be a good fit. How do you decide how much you're going to pay?
Uh-huh. Well, those are two different things. There's how much I can pay and how much I'm willing to pay.
Well, yes, but how do you decide for, let's just say you want to make an offer for a company. How do you decide what to put on that piece of paper?
So first there's what's the value for LinkedIn?
So how do you think about that?
I mean, it's like a traditional sort of modeling, right?
Most of these are so early stage companies, modeling revenue or earnings or any of that sort of stuff it's like hocus pocus.
But it's not standalone. It's like, what is my expectation of their impact on LinkedIn? And then what does that mean within the scope of LinkedIn, right? So you could say an engagement acquisition doesn't have any revenues attached to it. It's true. But we know fairly well how to translate engagement into dollars for the rest of the LinkedIn ecosystem. And so that's the proxy that we would use. But effectively, it goes back to this point, which is like, what's the one metric, what are the metrics, but what's the one metric you're really trying to move the needle on with this acquisition? And then our job to value that, basically.
So let's go back to our hypothetical, AI LinkedIn learning example. How would you look at that? What's the value that the company's raised, whatever, $30 million. They've got, a good bunch of metrics that show, but it's early stage. They've got a good bunch of metrics that show that, through their tool, the people that are looking for classes or other kind of educational materials have a 40% better chance of finding out what they want. And their pitch to you is if you apply that to LinkedIn, it'll give you a certain amount of lift. So is that worth $20 million? Is it worth $100 million? Is that worth $200 million? What's that worth?
Well, so we look at what that lift is. So assume, say, lift is conversion into people paying for classes or people getting jobs. And we translate that back then into what that means for our businesses. Like if it translates, hey, we're going to be able to show this to X million people in the feed, 0.4% more are going to convert to, say, buying a LinkedIn course, then that's how we're going to go about valuing it.
And so whose job is that? So the product manager, again, is saying, I think this would really help me with my goals to increase engagement. And they're going to, it's going to go, Ben, we got to buy this thing. And, do you say, well, what's it worth to you? Or do you say, well, as far as I can tell, it's only worth X?
No, we work with them on the business case very closely. From the point of view of the business metrics, we then translate that into how much that's worth to LinkedIn. But the question could be how much are we comfortable based on having maybe worked with a company or having tested with a company or based on previous initiatives? How much do we think it can create in terms of uplift and sort of what's the business logic? And then we translate the business logic in dollars.
You see, I'm a product manager at LinkedIn. I'm in charge of this particular aspect of engagement, right? And I'm thinking, man, this would really make my life better. I could hit my goals so much easier. Do I really care whether LinkedIn pays $50 million or $100 million or $1 billion? There must be some sort of internal brake on that person. They're pounding the table to say, look, we got to have this. One of our competitors is going to get it or make better, because the guy's not paying the money out of his own pocket. It's corporate money, right?
Yeah, totally. But then you have to actually make a case for why you're going to have such an impact. And by the way, that's not make my goals easier. Those are new goals that you're going to have to hit.
You're signing yourself up for something extra,
yeah.
Right? And are you involved in saying like, Paul, you're completely insane. We're never going to spend $300 million on this company? Or is your job to kind of help him, make the best possible case to whoever the ultimate decision maker is?
No, that's where our job is to be in between there. Funny enough, like I don't have the case of people saying, oh, let's go buy $500 million for something that you're looking at it and you're like, this is so minuscule. I don't see how that's going to happen. It comes back to you have a sense when you start getting to certain level of approvals or engagement with a company, you have a sense for how much they're going to cost, what's their last valuation, those type of things, and what type of an impact you think it's going to drive. So you can pretty early on in the process start to see if things are going to match or not. And so it's iterative because then like at some point, maybe they've got other offers, you end up with sort of a formal process. But generally it's, the PMs are senior enough, and that's where having PMs, again, whose job is to have worked on multiple of those, help with the prioritization. But by the time you end up with something that is worth prioritization, the pricing will not necessarily appear crazy to anyone. Like, it's hard to make the case? Like, is it a stretch? Like, sometimes you have to think through these, but the case of, oh, you're completely crazy, that's just not realistic, we don't actually see.
I guess there's all this signaling going on behind, before that.
Of course.
Yeah. To let everyone know.
My team is not doing their job if they don't have an indication, at least, or a sense of what this could be both worth and how much could this cost as we go through those discussions. They're designed in some ways for that as well, right? If anything, the first few gates are, is it worth even spending cycles on something from purely making trade-off on PM and engineering time? Like, is this an area that is a priority enough that you want to spend people's time? And so the more you go through the process, the more the alignments between the potential impact for LinkedIn and the ability to pay sort of aligns before you even have that explicit conversation.
Yeah. I think from the outside world, both to founders who typically have an engineering bias in this business, obviously, but they think of it as much more algorithmic, but it really isn't. It's much more of an art than a science. Having
First,
to find.
it's a discovery.
Yeah.
It's a discovery process. Discovery on fit, both from a team and product standpoint and vision. And then you discover what the art of the possible is on the deal itself.
Right. Right. So now tell me a little bit about kind of the decision matrix. Okay. So teams fit well. You think that there's an interesting opportunity here. The valuation is you're guessing kind of within the ballpark of what's possible. What happens after that? What's the decision chain for making actually something happen?
It's those two clear sort of gates, if you will, is the alignment on strategy. Why does this make sense? Alternatives, even sort of how are we going to integrate it? What will it start looking like within the environment of LinkedIn? And then the alignment on the financial value, which, by the way, the financial value is a much more restricted conversation group. So to your point, like, does the PM get excited at 500 million or 300 million? In many ways, they don't really know.
They don't know if they're excited, or they don't know they're not involved in the.
They're not necessarily involved in even knowing how much we're willing to pay or how much we're paying. Some of them are, but we try to limit that conversation because the whole point of an M&A is it useful for what we're trying to do, our vision and our product roadmaps? Like, in many ways, that's what the teams, product and R&D should tell us. And then for us to evaluate how much LinkedIn, with sort of FP&A and my boss was the CFO, etc., how much are we willing to pay? But we want to actually avoid contamination the other way around, which is people starting to do math in their heads and being like, oh, I can't pay X, or it's like, that's not the question. The question is it worth the pain of integration, etc., to you so that you're excited about the outcomes?
So, okay, go back to our example here. LinkedIn says, you say, hey, Paul, we're really interested in buying your company. Sally over there thinks you'd be a great fit for her product organization. And, we're going to send you a term sheet. We're willing to pay you $100 million. And then I say, what? My company's worth 5 times that. And then I go and I complain to Sally about wasting my time and like, how are you guys deciding on all this sort of stuff?
Yeah,
and
there's enough signaling ahead of time that this particular situation wouldn't happen.
Okay. All right. Let's just say we're going back in the negotiation. I'm going to go back and talk to my board. They're pushing me for more money. I go back to, yeah, of course. Right. It's the process. And then, I go back to, is that conversation then, is Sally out of the loop on that whole thing? And it's just back and forth between, you and your boss?
Yeah, mostly.
You set some sort of internal guideline of like how much you guys you bought off on the argument that we should buy this company.
Yeah,
you set
that's
some
the
sort
strategy conversation.
Right. You set some sort of internal guideline about like how much we'll pay. It's a range probably in there.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's just a negotiation back and forth between, whoever's on the company side and corporate development. Sally's kind of out of the loop.
Yeah. It's a little bit the same as, actually, for good reasons. And it's a little bit the same as the main reason why when you negotiate a job, you're negotiating your salary with the recruiter, not with your actual boss. Because very likely you're going to work with Sally. Maybe Sally will be your manager. And you don't want sort of weird dynamics to result from negotiation. So my job is to have those harsh conversations, to be the bad guy, so that when you finally join LinkedIn, you can say, oh, I'm not sure I want to talk to Ben, but I'm so excited about the rest of LinkedIn.
Right. That's the job. I got it. Well, cool. I mean, I think that it's super helpful. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but what other wisdom would you give a founder who was, interested in having their company ultimately acquired at some point or another? Or just ultimately figuring out how to work with either LinkedIn or any big company?
There's 2 elements. One is what I've mentioned, sort of pretty early on, frankly. You should know who are the 3 people you'd be excited by buying you. And those are going to evolve over time. But the reality is having a conversation with these folks once every 6 months doesn't cost much focus or anything. You will learn some stuff. You will learn some stuff about the markets because you're working with PMs that are looking at the broad similar spaces. So it's not a waste of time, in my opinion, and it's not big enough. Like basically, we're saying 6 half an hour to 45 minutes a year. The list of who are those companies will evolve over time as you sort of find your product market fit, as you develop your markets, etc. But that always is easy because that's always helpful because either you start getting into more serious conversation with someone and you can reach back out. You're going to learn stuff. Maybe you're not happy with the term sheet you're getting. And so at some point, and I mean, given the 2021 valuations and things like that, I think we're going to have a wave of those where people are not going to be happy with what their next play can be, and they're going to explore what alternatives are. And it's so much more efficient and easier to have those conversations when we already know each other. So that's one. Once you're big enough in terms of having overlap in terms of customers, it's oftentimes worth also figuring out partnerships with companies. BizDev and CorpDev tend to generally work closely together. Partnerships are always useful, and especially with sort of logo companies, both for your customer outreach and for your sort of management of VC relationship and image. And then, the reality is use CorpDev or the strategy team or whoever it is to get to the right conversation. But I don't think, and I've been at other companies, like I don't think the right conversation isn't product and engineering. But by that I mean it is the right conversation, and you can use CorpDev to sort of navigate, make sure you're talking to the right people.
Right. Okay. Yep, that makes sense. And thanks for coming on the show and giving us your wisdom.
Very happy to, and let me know if there are follow-ups or if I can engage further.
Yeah. Apple loves feedback, so please rate the show and let us know what you think. And we'll be back at you next week. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Paul.
You've been listening to Outcome by Design with Paul Weinstein. Don't miss any of our upcoming stories from the tech world. Subscribe to Outcome by Design wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave us a quick review. You can also send your comments directly to info@paulvweinstein.com. Until next time.